Going down as a great president requires a little bit of luck. Many times, presidents will benefit from positive things happening in the country that they had nothing to do with. In some cases, a less popular president who came before them was the one who laid the seeds for their success. But what do those situations look like? Welcome into the History Bus Hub. In this video, we're going to take a look at the 10 presidents who claimed credit for things that were the result of actions taken by one of their predecessors. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment too, tell me what you think. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything related from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. For this list, we're specifically looking at things previous presidents did while in the White House that benefited future presidencies. George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Dwight Eisenhower helped several future presidents for their roles in helping the country win the American Revolution, Civil War, and World War II respectively, but those are things they did as generals, not presidents, so those actions wouldn't count on this list. Also, it has to be results that were inevitable regardless of what the president who got the credit did. For instance, although John Adams laid the foundation for the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson is still the one who orchestrated it, so he deserves the credit that he gets for it. Similarly, while Benjamin Harrison laid the foundation for the Progressive Era with the Sherman Antitrust Act and Forest Reserve Act, Teddy Roosevelt still had to use the power given to him with those laws to break up big businesses and conserve so much public land. We're looking at actions taken by previous presidents that future presidents got credit for and had absolutely nothing to do with. Now let's dive in. Number 10. James Monroe. The last president to be elected with no competition, James Monroe is most closely associated with being in office during the era of good feelings. This was a period of no partisan divide because the death of the Federalist Party had already happened, economic conditions by and large had improved because of the acceleration of the market revolution, where the US transitioned from a society of self-sufficient farming to one of interconnected markets and businesses based on goods and services, and there was an explosion in American pride and patriotism. Monroe rode this wave to two terms in 1816 and 1820, running unopposed the second time as a Democratic Republican. He had nothing to do with it as president, though. This was all the result of decades of work laid by George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. The most prominent cause of ushering in this era was the US battling Great Britain to a draw in the War of 1812. That did far more to foster nationalist pride than anything else. Madison led the US through that entire war. The Louisiana Purchase, orchestrated by Jefferson, is what created the economic security needed to fuel and for the US to benefit from the market revolution. And the Federalist Party had been out of power since Jefferson's election in 1800. The Louisiana Purchase and War of 1812 just led to the party's collapse. So Monroe was able to sit pretty in the White House and enjoy a smooth presidency, operating largely under the idea that the good times would never end. Of course, they did end with the Panic of 1819, the addition of Missouri that triggered the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and the split in the Democratic-Republican Party that resulted in a four-way election in 1824, in which John Quincy Adams controversially won over Andrew Jackson, despite picking up fewer popular and electoral college votes. But none of that hurt Monroe politically, so he's on this list. Number 9. Ulysses S. Grant. Modern-day historians look back on Ulysses S. Grant's presidency in tragic fashion. His Reconstruction efforts after the Civil War were noble, but doomed to fail because of the 4 years of damage already caused by Andrew Johnson, the worst president ever, before Grant took over. Which is why Grant's also on my list of presidents who took the blame for previous administration's decisions, linked down below. There were also several corruption scandals in his cabinet, none of which he was ever sufficiently linked to. However, while Johnson sabotaged Grant, Abraham Lincoln actually set Grant up for success beforehand, and during his first term, Grant was wildly popular for a forgotten about part of Reconstruction, the post-Civil War economic boom in the North. Rapid industrialization that was the result of wartime efforts led to a high supply of goods in the economy, and businesses were thriving because of the support from the federal government during the war, all paid for by Abraham Lincoln's establishment of a temporary income tax. Lincoln also drove westward expansion by signing the Homestead Act of 1862, opening up millions of acres of land out west for settlers to move. He also established a new national bank with the National Currency Act of 1863, bringing some stability back to the rapid industrial growth in the North, and he funded several infrastructure projects for canals and railroads. Oh, and he passed the Land Grant Act of 1862, giving federal land grants to states to establish colleges, which is what led to the rise of state schools across the nation. All of this gave Grant a lot of political capital, which is why he was able to win re-election in 1872 over Horace Greeley, despite his cabinet's corruption scandals and the public souring on Reconstruction. To be fair, he was helped by Greeley running a horrible campaign, which you can learn about in my video on the 10 worst campaigns in presidential history, linked down below. Now, the Panic of 1873 did set in after his second term began, which was a market correction from the Civil War boom and way too much speculation on railroads, and that did hurt Grant's second term and led to Democrats taking back Congress in 1874. And Grant was initially blamed for seeming to prolong the Depression with his hard money policy, like passing the Coinage Act of 1873 and Specie Resumption Act of 1875 to put the US on the gold standard, while also vetoing a currency bill in 1874 to flood the economy with paper money. But by and large, average life had still improved in the 1870s over the 1860s because of the rapid industrialization that Lincoln pushed for. So the Dems lost seats in the House in 1876, while the Republicans maintained control of the White House with Rutherford B. Hayes' election. I know you're going to bring up the compromise of 1877 that led to Hayes winning since he lost the popular vote and had a disputed electoral college win. But it's well documented today that without voter intimidation and violence by white Southerners, Hayes would have won that election outright. Number 8. Grover Cleveland. Although his second term was marred by a crisis he didn't cause, Grover Cleveland only got that second term because of nostalgia from his first term that he wasn't responsible for either. Before Donald Trump, Cleveland was the only president to be elected to non-consecutive terms, becoming the first Democrat in 28 years to win the White House in 1884 before losing it in 1888 to Benjamin Harrison, and then winning it again, beating Benjamin Harrison in a rematch in 1892. Cleveland lost the 1888 election despite winning the popular vote because of his opposition to protective tariffs, which cost him in industrial swing states, most notably his home state of New York, to Harrison. Although the unpopular McKinley tariff helped Cleveland get re-elected in 1892 over Harrison, a huge reason for his re-election is an issue he deserves no credit for: corruption. After Harrison's 4 years saw him add 6 states just to increase his Republican Party's majorities in the Senate, most notably splitting North and South Dakota, and after his violation of the principle of civil service reform by caving to Republican pressure and stacking federal positions with its supporters, most notably firing over 43,000 postmasters and replacing them with Republican loyalists, the 1892 election helped create a level of nostalgia for Cleveland's perceived opposition to the spoils system. Here's the truth, though. Cleveland had nothing to do with the civil service reform that hindered the spoils system in his first term. Cleveland became president after his predecessor, Chester Arthur, signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883, which established the U.S. merit system for federal employment as a way to counter presidents' abuses of federal appointments by giving positions to their friends, which Andrew Jackson started when he became president. Arthur signed the law after his predecessor, James Garfield, was assassinated by a man who thought he deserved a job in Garfield's cabinet because he was a member of Garfield's campaign team in 1880. Under Cleveland, up to 40% of jobs were moved into the merit system because of this law that was passed before he took office. This portrayed him as an uncorruptible president focused on just hiring the right people to do a job, a reputation that only helped with the fact that he stood up to Tammany Hall while governor of New York and fought against the machine politics of northeastern cities while mayor of Buffalo. But in reality, most of his anti-corruption image was fake. Cleveland was forced to move away from civil service reform by law. Truth be told, though, his personal corruption may have actually been worse than that of any Gilded Age president. In 1874, Cleveland impregnated 36-year-old Maria Halpin in what she described as a non-consensual encounter, and as the former sheriff of Erie County, he used his influence to have her committed to an asylum after that accusation. That may be the most corrupt thing any president has ever done on a personal level, but it didn't matter because he had created an aura around himself that he was able to live up to in his first term because of what Arthur signed, and that fueled his comeback and re-election bid in 1892. Ironically, while that may have gotten him back into office, his second term was derailed, also by his predecessor, as Harrison's passage of the McKinley Tariff and Sherman Silver Purchase Act created the Panic of 1893, which plagued Cleveland's entire presidency from 1893 to 1897. He was blamed for the panic's conditions getting significantly worse, even though he was the one who took the steps to pull the US out of it, which his successor got the credit for, and leads to our next president. Number 7. William McKinley. First elected in 1896, Republican William McKinley coasted to re-election in 1900 in a rematch against William Jennings Bryan for 2 reasons: U.S. victory in the Spanish-American War and the economic prosperity of the late 1890s. McKinley was seen as the man who pulled the U.S. out of the Panic of 1893. But truth be told, he had nothing to do with it. Cleveland was actually the one who created the prosperity by returning to sound money, moving away from free silver in his second term by repealing the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and selling government bonds to replenish gold reserves. He also repealed the McKinley tariff, which was a severe tariff ironically written and championed by McKinley himself when he was a congressman from Ohio. So McKinley is responsible for the policy that made the Panic of 1893 so severe, but its severity is also what led to him winning the election of 1896, since any Republican was winning that year, and then he coasted off of the recovery that he isn't responsible for either. Now, to be fair, as president, McKinley did re-establish tariffs with the Dingley tariff, but that was during a period of economic recovery, so it wasn't going to have the same negative effects that the McKinley tariff had. The recovery was so strong that in future decades, the McKinley years became nostalgically known as the Gay 90s, as the economic strength coincided with the transition from the strict Victorian era of the 19th century to a cheerful, carefree era of the turn of the 20th century, marked by changes in technology and industry associated with the Gilded Age. McKinley can thank Cleveland for that. Of course, it's not like he got to enjoy the political success for too long, as he was assassinated in 1901. Number 6. Calvin Coolidge. The president most closely associated with the Roaring Twenties, Calvin Coolidge was lucky enough to leave office before the onset of the Great Depression that he helped cause. He was also lucky enough to become president just as the post-war economic boom was taking off. The Roaring Twenties can really be attributed to two things done by Woodrow Wilson: the creation of the Fed with the Federal Reserve Act and ensuring total victory for the Allies in World War I. The Fed was able to increase credit availability and spur investment after the war, and the US, being the only industrialized country not devastated by the war, turned it into an economic superpower, going from a debtor nation to the world's leading creditor, fueled by massive exports of food, raw materials, and manufactured goods to support European war efforts. Then, in the 1920s, that growth made the US the only industrialized country that could export products. Make no mistake, this was only possible because Wilson got the US involved in the war, regardless of how he got to that point. Without US involvement, the war likely ends in a negotiated stalemate, which would have limited the need for US wartime exports. In a twisted way of looking at things, it also wouldn't have devastated the European economy as severely as it did, which would have made the US less dominant in manufacturing than it became in the 1920s. Initially, the end of the war caused a depression because of factory retooling, demilitarization, and the aftermath of the Spanish flu, which made Wilson wildly unpopular in 1920 and ushered in the dominance of the laissez-faire Republicans for the entire 1920s decade, starting with Warren G. Harding becoming president after campaigning on a return to normalcy. Harding passed a series of major tax cuts in 1921, and he cut federal spending by 50%. The inevitable post-war economic boom led many to mistakenly credit those laissez-faire policies for the Roaring Twenties. After Harding's death, Coolidge just continued them, and he was associated with the good times of that decade. There are lots of reasons to dislike Wilson, from his racism to his suppression of free speech to his complete mishandling of US involvement in World War I, from lying about whether or not he would get the country involved to seeing all of its goals fail with the Treaty of Versailles. But the fact of the matter is, he is responsible for the Roaring Twenties, and nobody rode that wave of his efforts more than Coolidge. Number 5. Dwight Eisenhower. Just like Calvin Coolidge, Dwight Eisenhower was lucky enough to take over the United States after it had completed the transition from a wartime economy into a peacetime economy, which ushered in an economic boom, and he got all the credit for it. The Eisenhower years of the 1950s is considered the golden age of American capitalism, where record prosperity coincided with a record number of people entering the middle class, so a record number of people got to enjoy prosperity. It remains the greatest peacetime economy in the history of the world. But let's be honest about its success. Eisenhower took over in 1953, 8 years after World War II. Europe and Asia were still rebuilding from the deadliest global conflict in world history, and once again, the US escaped relatively unscathed at home. On top of that, Harry Truman was the one to navigate the country through the post-war transition from the record inflation that came with the move to a peacetime economy to crafting the United States' foreign policy in the outbreak of the Cold War. The roughness of that transition resulted in Truman leaving office wildly unpopular. Inflation peaked at 19.7% under him in 1947, and although he won re-election in 1948, as we now know from recent times, the after effects of high inflation are usually felt worse than the inflation itself many times. However, in his final year in office, inflation was down at 1.92%, and GDP growth was 5.36%. Meanwhile, although he got the US involved in the Korean War in 1950, Truman was 2 years into negotiating an armistice agreement by the time he left office in 1953, one that was signed 6 months into Eisenhower's first year as president. So Truman set Eisenhower up for the inevitable record peacetime economic growth that was to come. On top of that, the New Deal programs from the Depression, most notably the GI Bill, generated a level of income for citizens never before seen, allowing more of them than ever before to purchase homes, cars, and luxury items and build wealth never before seen in history. So Eisenhower was able to cash in on Franklin D. Roosevelt's policies. All Eisenhower had to do was not screw it up. And to his credit, he didn't, which is why he gets credit for a future economy and leads to our next president. Number 4, Lyndon B. Johnson. Although he left office wildly unpopular, Lyndon B. Johnson is arguably the most successful legislative president in U.S. history at implementing his agenda. That was due to the political winds being at his back the way they have never been at a president's back, thanks to the sympathy from John F. Kennedy's assassination and the strong economy of the 1960s. Those two things resulted in LBJ's landslide election over Barry Goldwater in 1964, where the liberal wing of his Democratic Party took clear majorities in both chambers of Congress. He can thank Dwight Eisenhower for that economy, though. While president in the 1950s, Eisenhower used the economic prosperity to heavily invest in infrastructure and new technology, and he paid for it all by keeping the high tax rates, which resulted in 93% on the top 1% being paid in taxes to the federal government. Those investments included creating the National Highway System with the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, laying the groundwork for computer science research by establishing the Advanced Research Projects Agency in 1958, and creating the space program in 1958. All of these policies created tons of jobs in the 60s and led to immense growth. The Interstate Highway Act would naturally lead to lots of construction jobs, and with up to 30,000 miles of interstate built by the end of the 1960s, businesses were able to grow significantly by reducing freight costs but still hiring more people in areas like the trucking industry. Computer science research allowed them to find ways to better store data and keep their books, while also leading to the creation of IT departments. Simply put, they were saving costs but increasing their available jobs. That's a win-win if you could ever get one in the economy. Meanwhile, the space program created several jobs in research, contracting, and technology. LBJ was there to take the credit for it all, but Eisenhower made it possible. 2 recessions in the late 1950s that were just mild market corrections from the post-war boom weren't Eisenhower's fault, but they helped result in the close election of JFK and LBJ in 1960 over Richard Nixon. JFK initiated a tax cut to bring the top rates down to roughly 70%, and then began the pilot programs of what will become the Great Society legislation under LBJ. Because the economic growth coincided with JFK and LBJ's policies, they were seen as driving the growth, not Eisenhower's policies of the 1950s. Of course, after LBJ's election, his presidency was derailed by Vietnam, resulting in him leaving office wildly unpopular in 1969, and the chaos in Vietnam is actually rooted in imperialist ambitions by Eisenhower that he still doesn't get enough blame for. But during the decade, LBJ got a lot of credit for an economy that Eisenhower left him, and honestly, modern historians view LBJ in a new light by giving him credit for much of his Great Society legislation, but it's important to note that a lot of that wouldn't have been possible had Eisenhower's policies not created a strong enough economy that gave the federal government the luxury of passing those big spending programs. Number 3, Ronald Reagan. The last truly transformative president in American history, Ronald Reagan's dramatic impact on American politics is due to him pursuing a bold agenda that aligned with an economic boom on the heels of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression at that time. Reagan beat Jimmy Carter and was elected on the heels of the 1970s, which saw the first 2 periods of sustained stagflation, where inflation went up while the country was in a recession, in history. In Reagan's case, he took over amid stagflation and astronomically high interest rates, hitting 21.5% in 1980. In his first 2 years as president, he passed dramatically high tax cuts, bringing the top marginal tax rate down from 71% to 28%, while also deregulating the financial sector, most notably lifting barriers from the types of investments in the stock markets different companies like savings and loans companies can make, and cutting federal spending on healthcare, education, and welfare with his Budget Act in 1981. Well, by 1983, the US began to see an unprecedented experience of economic gains. Over the course of Reagan's presidency, inflation dropped from 13.5% to 4.1%, interest rates and unemployment were cut in half, and GDP grew a total of 26%. Reagan's policies were credited with this turnaround and became orthodoxy in economic circles, which they still are to this day. Both parties embraced low taxes on the rich, deregulation, and limiting the social safety net, which is why we're still in what many historians call the Reagan era. However, a deeper dive shows that's not what broke the back of inflation and got the US out of stagflation. It was actually Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, who turned things around. The period of stagflation was the result of a reckless monetary policy by Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon, who used a combination of price controls and political pressure on the Fed to keep interest rates artificially low to keep the economy from collapsing under them as they increased spending on programs like the Vietnam War. Carter and Gerald Ford before him were left holding the bag, and Volcker, whom Carter appointed Fed chair in 1979, realized he would have to insanely spike interest rates and trigger multiple double-dip recessions to correct the market. He did just that, costing Carter his presidency. It actually continued into Reagan's first 2 years in office, which is why Reagan had such a bad midterm election in 1982 where the Democrats picked up 26 seats in the House. But the policy worked and triggered the dramatic turnaround. Reagan basically took credit for work done by a Carter appointee, meaning he took credit for Carter's work. Also, before Reagan deregulated the financial sector, Carter was the one who actually began the deregulatory era, but he did so in industry in the late 1970s, deregulating the trucking, airline, and brewing industries. This is what fostered competition, lowered costs, and led to the growth of new innovative businesses like FedEx in the 1980s, and his legalization of home brewing is responsible for America becoming the global hub of craft breweries. Simply put, Carter's efforts are what triggered the economic turnaround of the 1980s. Reagan also gets credit for winning the Cold War with his Star Wars program, where he dramatically increased defense spending to bankrupt the Soviet Union, but it is fair to say he played his part in winning the Cold War the same way every other president did before him. Number 2. Bill Clinton. Following Ronald Reagan's success in the 1980s, Bill Clinton enjoyed an even greater period of prosperity as president in the 1990s, where unemployment dropped below 4%, GDP grew an average of 3.5%, inflation remained low, usually around 3%, and interest rates were half of what they were even in the Reagan years. Meanwhile, the US achieved balanced budgets in Clinton's final 4 years in office. The prospect of paying off the national debt was very real, and the country wasn't at war. So this was the longest period of peacetime expansion in history. From a numbers game, Clinton pretty much accomplished everything a president intends to accomplish, which is why he had the highest approval rating of any president in the post-World War II era upon leaving office, despite his impeachment in 1998 over a sex scandal. But the economic success, balanced budgets, and period of peace had almost nothing to do with him. Clinton took over on the heels of the early 1990s recession under George H.W. Bush, a recession that came out of the savings and loan crisis of 1987. This was a natural market correction, so anybody who took office in 1993 was going to preside over a period of economic growth that came after that. Bush, though, took quite a few steps to make it significantly better for Clinton. For starters, Bush passed the High Performance Computing Act of 1991. This bill created the National Research and Educational Network to connect computers across the country and also established the Mosaic web browser. Simply put, it gave all computers access to the internet. Written by then Senator Al Gore, it's basically the bill Gore used to invent the internet. This fueled the dot-com bubble in the 1990s, allowing for the e-commerce market to boom, and it's what propped up the Clinton economy. Bush also signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was a catalyst for technological innovation in the 1990s, as establishments had to find new ways to accommodate those with disabilities. Companies that make automatic doors, for instance, naturally boomed because of that. So Bush created the Clinton economy. Bush also helped spur Clinton's balanced budgets with his 1990 budget bill, which reduced spending on certain social programs for higher income earners and raised taxes, a break from his pledge in 1998 to not raise taxes. Clinton played his part to balance the budget, though, with his tax increases in 1993 and his 1996 welfare reform bill. All in all, Clinton rode a wave established by Bush, and it makes people nostalgic for his presidency to this day. Before we get to our final president who took credit for other people's work, I want to address a couple of honorable mentions. James K. Polk is credited for doubling the size of the country while president, but the centerpiece of that expansion was the annexation of Texas, and while he oversaw the state's formal admittance to the Union, his predecessor, John Tyler, is responsible for it happening. Tyler was the one who got a joint resolution through Congress to admit Texas, and he's the one who signed it on his last day in office. However, Polk did have to navigate the Mexican-American War that came in the aftermath of it, so he did play his part and deserves his credit. The popularity of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs in the 1930s can largely be traced to Herbert Hoover. Contrary to popular belief, Hoover took an interventionist role in the economy after the Great Depression, and it was he who started many of the public works and infrastructure projects that put people back to work, most notably the Hoover Dam. But FDR did take it to another level with his programs, so he didn't just coast on what Hoover did, which is why he didn't make this list either. And the final president to receive credit for the work of previous administrations? Donald Trump. In 2020, Donald Trump lost his re-election bid due to a crisis by and large out of his control, the COVID-19 pandemic. Then Joe Biden took credit for the vaccine rollout that was actually the result of Trump's initiative, Operation Warp Speed. However, as Biden's presidency drug on, post-COVID inflation surged, wrecking people's lives, and questions arose about just how necessary the lockdowns, masks, and vaccines were in some people. Nostalgia for the strong economy in Trump's first term pre-pandemic grew. And that led to him beating Kamala Harris in 2024, joining Grover Cleveland as the only president to lose his re-election bid and then come back to win the White House 4 years later. But that strong economy that everybody was nostalgic for in Trump's first term had nothing to do with him. Trump took over for Barack Obama on the heels of the longest economic expansion in U.S. history already to that point, which ended up lasting from 2009 to 2020 and was a period of consistent but modest GDP growth. His economic numbers over those 3 years were by and large identical to the 4 years of Obama's second term. Both, by and large, averaged about 200,000 jobs added a month, and they had the same average GDP growth at 2.3%. Consensus now is that the economic growth was driven by the policies in response to the financial crisis in the form of bailouts passed by both Obama and George W. Bush to prevent a Great Depression, and the stimulus package that Obama passed in 2009. Now, to be fair, Trump did pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, and GDP slightly grew in 2018 and 2019, even though interest rates also rose. So you could say he took steps to continue the growth, or maybe improve upon it depending on how you view that legislation. You could even say you think the bank bailouts are actually what slowed the recovery and growth though, but there's really no getting around the fact that by and large, the economic growth numbers under Trump were almost identical to what they were under Obama. It was truly the same economy. But if things keep growing, they're going to seem better towards the end than the beginning, so Trump got very high marks on the economy in his first term. Whether or not that economy was working for everybody is a totally different debate, and one that Trump and Obama have to answer for. The point is, the Trump economy was a continuation of the Obama economy, which was the result of policies put in place by Obama and Bush, and he got enough credit for it to fuel his political comeback. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. Which president would you say received the most undeserved credit in US history? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more History Buffs Hub videos in the future.